Rawya, who I've followed for a very long time, is Amnesty International Senior Crisis Advisor. Her work here includes documenting the violations of human rights violations in the Philippines, Syria, and Yemen. Prior to that, she was a journalist for 15 years, covering the Middle East and Africa for the Associated Press and Al Jazeera English. Rawya?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning, for the Foundation and the Center for National Security for putting this incredible event together, and Dr. Dalia for moderating this important discussion. Incredible points brought up by all my fellow panelists here, so I'll try to keep my remarks very brief. As a senior researcher with Amnesty International, my work on Yemen has touched on all of the themes that my fellow panelists here raised, and I must say this is my second all-women panel in this exact room, so thank you, Karen, and everyone. So it was really amazing to come here. As I mentioned, as a researcher for Amnesty International, I've been part of the work on documentation of human rights violations in Yemen. And if we just take a look at, I'd like to acknowledge the date. We're gathered here today. In just a few weeks, we'll be marking what is 4 years since the campaign of bombardment led by the Saudi and UAE-led coalition targeting the Houthi armed group in Yemen. And since that coalition-led bombardment started in March of 2015, Amnesty International has been documenting all sorts of violations committed by all parties to the conflict. So essentially all parties have been violating international humanitarian law, their obligations under international humanitarian law through attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. And what I want to point out here when we talk about the conflict in Yemen, and I really dislike sort of comparisons, but if you take a look at the more recent conflicts in the region and the intractable conflicts in the region, when we take a look at Yemen, the reality is that a lot of international parties have actual leverage in this particular conflict, right? There is much that can be done to stop these violations. This humanitarian crisis is an entirely man-made crisis. Yes, even before the war, some of the communities in Yemen were in a very difficult position, humanitarian-wise, but a lot of what we're seeing today is entirely man-made, and there's so much that can be done to stop it. The question is the actual willingness and all sorts of other calculations that come into play. So for example, if we take a look at the attacks that we've documented, whether Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or even, if I may cite the most recent reporting that we have from Muwatana, one of the more preeminent human rights organizations, one of the largest human rights organizations in Yemen. They just issued a really important report yesterday, which Afra mentioned, Rageh was testifying to Congress about. They documented from 2015 to 2018 at least 27 apparently unlawful coalition attacks in which weapons or parts of weapons from the US and the UK were used, right? So hence, the involvement of the international community is not just when it comes to leverage. There is essentially indirect involvement. Some may even call it complicity when you have weapons from all sorts of Western countries, from Australia, from South Korea, all sorts of governments providing weapons to the coalition that end up being used in illegal attacks in Yemen, causing massive civilian harm and damage to civilian infrastructure. There can be much that can be done, and that's why we have a consistent call at Amnesty International. In fact, it's a call that other human rights organizations share to halt armed transfers to these countries that are involved in these violations in Yemen, because we've seen their track record and how these weapons are being used. And it's been very inspiring to see the traction this is the movement that's happening, the bipartisan really activity that's happening on the Hill when it comes to this particular issue. But it's not just obviously the United States, there's so many other countries involved in this. One of the other aspects or violations that I'd like to bring up before we open it up for remarks, I just want to keep my remarks very brief so we have as much discussion as we can, is the issue of detention-related violations. We've documented violations by the Houthis as well as by the coalition in the south when it comes to arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearance, torture, and ill treatment. And this particular issue is really very close to my heart. I mean, one of the images that I find very difficult to get out of my mind from one of my recent trips my last trip to Yemen last summer were these group of mothers standing in 50-degree heat in Aden outside the house of the Minister of Interior. Some of these mothers hadn't known the whereabouts of their sons for up to 3 years. Imagine the agony of not just knowing that your son had been arbitrarily arrested, not knowing what he was arrested for, but not knowing whether he's even alive or not for 3 years. This pattern of violations is particularly problematic because it gets very little attention, and it's one that has the potential for very long-term damage, right? Once the bombs end, once the campaign of bombardment ends, people tend to forget about those who are missing and disappeared for years and years and years. Hence, it was very important to see the discussion about prisoners' exchange as part of the, or revealing the fate of the disappeared as part of the conversations in Stockholm and Sweden in the ceasefire talks. So that pattern of violation, again, and it's, by the way, one of the pattern of violations that, again, international parties have a lot of leverage in addressing. So just to give you a quick example, when our report this summer was coming out on enforced disappearance and torture by UAE forces and local forces backed by the UAE in southern Yemen, even before the report came out, in the 2 weeks prior to the report, when we submitted our findings to the government of Yemen and to the UAE authorities, sharing with them our findings and asking questions about some of the violations, that letter coincided with another story that the AP had, and AP had really been leading on this coverage as well as Human Rights Watch. Our report came as a one-year follow-up to that work by AP and Human Rights Watch. So our letters to the governments coincided with a new story by the AP about serious allegations of torture in these network of secret prisons that had been revealed the year prior. And just as these two pieces of, the letters and the stories came out were handed to the governments, we saw large numbers of people being transferred from unofficial facilities to official facilities, as well as some releases from these prisons. In other words, pressure does yield results when it comes to the question of detentions and enforced disappearance. The important thing is to keep up this pressure and to keep up this kind of work and documentation.
Thank you so much.